Hello everybody. So it's Friday the 24th of April now, and this week with the coronavirus, the government and the mainstream media have introduced two new narratives that weren't there before. Now that we are at the peak and past the peak of the virus, and in my opinion it's time to end or at least to ease the lockdown and start getting businesses open. What they're now saying is that we need to keep the lockdown going because otherwise there'll be a second wave. And there's a danger that their second wave will be worse than the first wave. Well, this is not something that anyone was saying or even hinting would be the case at the beginning of the lockdown, which happened 3 or 4 weeks ago. And they're also saying that the only way to come out of this fully is to have a vaccine and develop a vaccine. And that might not happen for another 18 months or 2 years, if at all, because there's no guarantee that all the money that they're putting into vaccine research now is actually going to come up with anything. No guarantee whatsoever. So what will happen if there isn't a vaccine for another 5 years or never? Are we going to stay in lockdown for 5 years, 10 years? I mean, this is a ridiculous situation. What the mainstream media are also doing is that they are continuing to smear Sweden, which for once in the last 20 years, it usually gets everything wrong, but for once I think it's done the right thing. And it hasn't closed down schools and businesses and clubs and bars and restaurants. And it's got a higher rate of mortality per million people than Norway and Denmark, but it's got a lower rate of mortality per million people than France and Spain and Italy and Belgium and the UK, the other countries in Western Europe. The mainstream media and the government are also completely ignoring and not saying anything about hydroxychloroquine, which when given with zinc sulfate and azithromycin has been shown to have very, very good effects in patients who receive those things in the early stages of the disease, in curing them and making them better. And there's been lots of evidence from individual patients and studies in different countries that have shown that, but they're just pretending that this doesn't exist, that there isn't a thing, just not mentioning it at all and hoping that people will stop talking about it, because what they're now doing is pumping the idea that there'll be a vaccine when that's not guaranteed at all. Look, I mean, in my view, I take the view that the politicians and MPs were bounced into this for two reasons. One is aggressive attack from the mainstream media as to the early strategy, which was for the UK to do the same thing as Sweden, to try to protect the vulnerable elderly in particular, but to let people who weren't going to be so affected by this to continue their lives as normal. And I think the government ran scared of the mainstream media because they didn't want to be accused of anything. And the other reason was the research that came from Professor Ferguson of Imperial College, who put out a paper of scientific advice. It was around the 16th of March, and it said, look, he said in the mathematical modelling that he did, he estimated that this coronavirus would kill 500,000 people in the UK. But if they put into place some of these measures, social distancing and lockdown measures, the number of deaths would be halved, which is where you got the sort of modelling for flattening the curve from. It comes from Professor Ferguson. So I think a lot of people, in the parliament who voted for this, one, they were frightened of the media, but also there was some genuine concern for the number of people who they were told were going to die from Professor Ferguson's models. And, I might have done the same thing if that's all I had to go on was some kind of advice that says, if you do this, you're going to save 250,000 lives. But the thing is, immediately after they've enacted this lockdown and new regulations and the Coronavirus Act, Professor Ferguson came back and said, oh no, look, it's not going to be 250,000 people that die, it's only going to be 20,000. So he drastically revised his models downwards straight after they'd put into place the regulations and the lockdown. But instead of going back and saying, oh look, there's new scientific advice here from the same person that got us to lock down the country, let's go back and revisit what we've done, because now we've got new advice which changes the whole situation. But they didn't do that. They went away to have a break. Parliament was closed down, and we are where we are. And a week ago, where they could have changed what they were doing, they didn't. And now they're creating these new narratives to continue and sustain this lockdown, which we didn't have before. It makes me very suspicious. And that's compounded by what some of the advisors are saying, that we're not going to release the scientific evidence and data upon which we're making the political decisions until the pandemic is over. So nobody is now going to be able to scrutinise the scientific advice which is being given to the government on which they're making their decisions, which I find very, very suspicious indeed. Look, I think some people genuinely thought this was the right thing to do, but I think looking at the effects of this, looking at the suspicious nature of withholding transparency which is now been coming in, the new narratives which have suddenly been created to justify continuing to lock down the United Kingdom, and also the evidence which is coming from Sweden and other countries which have done a different thing, and they have actually seen fewer deaths per million, as I said earlier, in the country. I think looking at all of those things, it's now time to revise this and to end the lockdown.